Hey everyone, Michael Unger here with another edition of Ask an Astronomer here with our trusted astronomer. Marley's just a couple doors down from me on unceded territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. How is it going, Marley?
It's good. I'm glad that it doesn't get dark at 4 p.m. anymore. So things are looking up.
Yeah, absolutely. I have noticed that as we leave work, the Earth is turning. I remember reading in a Carl Sagan book a long time ago that we didn't quite have the proper language, to say, oh, the Earth has turned to the proper occultation so that the sunlight can now stream overhead. We now say the sun is setting, which is not actually what's happening. The sun is not actually going anywhere. The Earth is just turning, and now we're kind of turning and tilting back. But that's very awkward to say.
Yeah, it is. No one likes to think about the Earth. Yeah, yeah. No, yeah. It's weird.
So the Earth is turning and tilting, and here we are. We are doing Ask an Astronomer in the daylight. If you are watching on any of the three platforms and want to get in on this conversation, because we've got some breaking news to share with you for today's episode. If you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, or even Instagram, jump on in with some questions about today's topic, which is about intuitive machines. Well, we're not talking about AI robots, although there is maybe a little bit of AI involved. But Intuitive Machines is actually the name of the company. The first commercial landing scheduled to land today. Not going to give it away, but let's get into this lunar landing that happened today, Marley.
Yeah. So Intuitive Machines, they had their landing attempt today. And I wanted to talk about it because I watched everything happen live. So it was very fun to watch with one of the interpreters. It was great. So this private company, Intuitive Machines, has developed a lander. They're calling this lander Odysseus, and it is trying today to touch down softly on the moon. So what is this mission exactly, and where did this come from? So the class of lander, I saw this described as is you think of them as a model, like a model of car, and then each model of car has its own name. So I guess
Hmm.
think of that. This is the Nova C lunar lander.
Okay.
The first one of the class of them is called Odysseus, and it is part of the IM-1 mission. So nothing as fancy sounding as Artemis. IM just stands for Intuitive Machines, right? Intuitive Machines -1, the first mission.
Hmm.
They are part of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or the CLPS, which is a NASA initiative where private companies get to bid on delivering payloads for NASA. So basically, NASA says, hey, we have a bunch of stuff we would love to send to the moon. It's expensive for us to do that. Anyone want to take it for us? And private companies go, please pay us to develop something to take it to the moon for you. So it's part of this way to try to meld and bring in private companies to hopefully overall lower the cost of space exploration, in particular, going to the moon. So the CLPS is actually part of the larger Artemis program umbrella. And so in the future, as time goes on, we'll start to see a lot more of these CLPS initiatives and these CLPS affiliated private companies that have won bids and are now being paid by NASA to move and develop and also deliver different NASA science to the surface of the moon. So in this case, this one is the Odysseus lander. This is a rendering of what it looks like when it's hopefully on the moon. And it will just kind of sit there. The lander itself doesn't do much. The lander itself is really just the vessel to get from point A to point B. It's designed to operate in sunlight, and so it is not designed to survive lunar night. So in the event that this survives its landing, it'll live for about 7 days until we end up at lunar night, at which point they don't expect it to survive. And so if it does, that'll be a huge surprise. It's not built to do that. Unlike some of the other not private companies, the other landers we've had. So like the ISRO lander earlier on
Hmm.
where that landed, it wasn't meant to survive lunar night, but maybe it did. It didn't. But this one for sure probably will not. So that's not to be surprised. This is carrying 12 different payloads. So it is a very robustly sized lander. And the contract is valued at 118 million US dollars. So they got paid a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of space, that's kind of on the lower end.
Right.
IM-1, so this mission launched February 15th. So it only launched last week and it entered lunar orbit yesterday, so February 21st. It's expected to land today, which would be in the middle of lunar day. So lunar day again is a full lunar day is two Earth weeks. So in the middle of the lunar day, it's supposed to land, and it is targeting the South Pole region. No surprise there. This has been the big region of discovery for the Artemis program and is kind of where all of the upcoming future lunar missions are focused on, with the exception of, I think there's one that wants to land on the near side of the moon, an interesting region on the near side. And then, of course, China, the Chang'e 6 mission, which wants to land on the far side of the moon. But most of them are being focused on the southern pole region. IM-1 is carrying 6 NASA instruments, so 6 little payloads that NASA has designed, and then 6 other payloads, like commercial partners, commercial payloads. And if this landing is successful, it will become the first soft landing for an American-made spacecraft since Apollo 17, which is a huge stretch of time since the last American-made thing landed on the moon. And it will also become the first soft lunar landing by a private company. So what we mean by soft landing is that it lands properly as opposed to like just crashing into the moon, right? So it's such a nice way of saying it makes it there, like it doesn't impact the moon. It's soft, controlled, lands itself, and it's okay. So if it does this, it'll be the first successful one.
Okay.
Yes, so that's kind of what's all hinging on this lander.
And these early landings on the moon, part of the Artemis mission, going to the South Pole, are they really test concepts? Like how much science is being involved in these missions?
A lot. So I have that a bit later on. They are like, a lot of them are tech demonstrations.
Okay.
Just to see if this technology will work on the moon. So one of them is already tech we use on Earth, but now we thought, hey, let's put it on the moon, which is one of my favorite tech demos. The commercial ones are, some of them would be counting as tech demonstrations. Some of them are, one of them is an art installation. So it really ranges between what we have on the commercial side. But none of them are focused on like looking for water, I guess, water ice. They're all focused on other elements of the launch and landing process from the moon. So this is a map of the South Polar region. I love this. It's for like a lunar atlas. I'm bad at maps, so this is really helpful for me. They are landing within this like 80-degree circle. So that's kind of where we mark where the South Polar region is called, right? 80, maybe a bit more, but usually within 80 degrees. This is the crater. It's called the Malapert crater. So it's weirdly shaped. It's got these fun, interesting ridges. It's not perfectly circular. And the Malapert crater has all these satellite craters off of it. So basically within a certain region, we just call them all the same name, just Malapert A, B, C, or D. They are hoping to land at, so here's the main Malapert crater. They're hoping to land over here at Site A, Malapert A, which is this satellite crater. Malapert A is about, I think, 24 kilometers in diameter and about 300 kilometers from the South Pole. So if successful, they land in this region, Intuitive Machines will be the closest to the South Pole out of anyone on the moon currently. And it's also very close to a massif. So a massif is like a mountain range on the moon, kind of. You can think of it that way, which is a candidate region for Artemis 3, a candidate landing region for Artemis 3. So successful, we'll kind of get an idea of what the terrain around this future landing region looks like and what we can expect and what might be hazards or benefits of landing in this region.
Okay.
This region was picked because it's the flattest out of all of them, which is what we want when we land something on the moon.
So just do a bit of review for those that are still kind of like learning about Artemis, but also for me as well, because as you just said, the candidate landing region for Artemis. So they know the region that they want to go to. They know that we want to go to the South Pole because deep inside those craters, there's potential for water ice. So all these craters that you're showing here in this photograph, are those all potential areas where there could be that water ice? And so it's this general region that we're kind of like find the best spots to land and potentially start those excursions to find that water ice?
Not all of these craters. So those craters, the permanently shadowed region craters, are the closer you get to the South Pole, the more that there are. And they're kind of centered around like the South Polar region. Like if I go back, if I go back a picture, PowerPoint, please. There it goes. If we look, they're kind of more like Shackleton is what we would consider one of those permanently shadowed regions, right? So Shackleton crater, Shoemaker, Cabeus is another one that has some of those properties. Malapert is not like a pure permanently shadowed region, but there are aspects of the craters that are in permanent shadows, but not the entire shadow itself, not the entire crater itself. So another part of why this region's picked is because we haven't explored really any other region of the moon aside from the near side. And so we don't know the terrain of this very well. And so you don't want to go right away where the worst things are going to happen, right? If there's going to be a lot of problems, it's going to be in this region at the very south, which is hard to communicate with because it's at the very bottom. And also if you are using something that is dependent on light, which the Odysseus lander is, this is going to be a bad spot for you because this is where you end up getting the most of those areas where they don't get any sunlight. Up near Malapert, the shadows get very long and some parts are continuously covered, but you still have areas of sunlight as well. So it's a balancing game. And that's also why it's a candidate region, a candidate landing region for Artemis 3, because that's the mission that will have people on it. And we would still need sunlight to support human beings on the surface, as well as for like communications. If there's any solar powered communications aspects, that would absolutely be necessary. Also, it gets very, very cold very, very quickly without the sunlight present. So we don't necessarily want to subject our astronauts to like negative 200 degrees. So yeah, places where the sun is still there. But there are areas where they are shadowed, like a happy medium of both is kind of why that's one of the candidates for Artemis 3.
Okay. First question related comes in from Instagram. So there's been a bunch of delays with Artemis. So are you able to give any kind of update on what the timelines for Artemis are? Like obviously, like the question is when we're going to land, but there's a few more steps to get to before humans land there. So do you have any kind of update on Artemis?
Yeah. So before we could do Artemis 3, which is to land people, we need to launch Artemis 2. Artemis 2 has been pushed back to no earlier than / they're targeting, I think it's November of 2025. So a year from now. Artemis 2 is the one where the Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen will be on board. He and 3 other NASA astronauts, they will fly around the moon and come back. And they are testing life support equipment and life support systems. So we know that they work. We don't know how well they work with people on board. So that's one of the things we want to test with that. Because that's such a fundamental part of sending people to space, because Artemis 2 got pushed back, Artemis 3, where we have people landing, that also gets pushed back. That's currently not set to go until no earlier than December 2026. Okay. And that is entirely dependent on the success of Artemis 2 and the human landing system, which is being developed by SpaceX, which has its own development process and its own development timeline, which the Government Accountability Office out of NASA, when it looked at NASA and looked at the Artemis program, they don't think that we're actually going to land with Artemis 3 until closer to 2027, 2028. But NASA's official timeline still says 2026. So there's a lot of moving pieces. I don't think they'll get there in 2026. That's just me, but that's their date.
Okay, so let's get back to the mission at hand here, Intuitive Machines. What are the payloads on this?
Yeah, so the 6 NASA payloads, they're all very interesting, but a lot of them are like tech demonstrations, and I've kind of starred my favorite ones, which were just interesting to me, but we only focus on one because I didn't want to bore people with radio observation data. But ROLSIS is a radio spectrometer. It stands for Radio Observations of the Lunar Surface, and it will measure electron density near the lunar surface because a larger amount of electron density makes it harder for communication signals to get through. So we want to make sure that at the lunar South Pole, the electron density is not like ridiculously high or weirdly low, like trying to figure out the average around the moon to help with communications and how it might affect radio observatories and observing solar and planetary radio waves and other phenomena. Because one of the other future lunar missions is to try to put a radio telescope on the far side of the moon or maybe near the lunar south pole. And so you want to make sure that you can actually get radio data from this area and make sure that the electron density will not impede any of that process.
Okay.
LRA is another one of my favorite. It stands for Laser Retroreflector Array. Basically, it's this, I have a picture of it, but it will allow spacecraft to ping it with lasers to help determine their precise distance for landings and also determine their distance while in lunar orbit. This is something we already do with satellites here on Earth. It's just very cool and it looks cool to be brought on the moon. And the other one I liked very much was SCALPS with two S's at the end, which stands for Stereo Cameras for Lunar Plume Surface Studies. So these are 4 tiny cameras near the base of the Odysseus lander, and they will capture images and footage of the landing to help understand how the exhaust from the lander interacts with the lunar surface. So we know that the lunar surface is coated in this regolith, like this very fine, sharp, dusty material. And so if that's accelerated, that can cause problems and threats to nearby spacecraft or habitats on the moon. So this is kind of us taking a look and seeing exactly what that movement of that regolith is like and what's going on there and how fast does it get, things like that. This is
Very
what
cool.
LRA looks like, which I just really like it.
Oh, yeah, it
But
looks beautiful.
it's so cool, right? This is like not the official one. This is like their base test, right? Their mock-up of what it is, but it's quite small. Those little mirrors are only about, I had it in my other notes, sorry. They're about 1.3 centimeters wide, each of those little
Okay, so it's
discs.
a tiny little piece here.
Yeah, tiny little pieces. But the idea is that so when you have a mirror and light has to hit it straight on to reflect back at you, with this, it has like a bunch of tiny mirrors. So no matter which way a spacecraft is coming, it'll be able to determine its distance from the surface based on the length of time it takes the laser to return back to it. Which is it's just very neat. And if you have enough of these like on the moon, it can kind of act as a GPS system like we have on Earth because you can know where you are at near constant time.
Okay, so back to like the big picture at hand here, because Artemis and these commercial landings are all working together. This is the part of the larger mission, which is not just one country, it's the Artemis Accord, which includes these private companies. And so that's kind of like what we're all kind of like leading towards, which is where we get to today, because they were to land on the moon. So Marley, like, well, don't leave us in suspense here. Did they land on the moon?
Yeah. But with the comms issue, like they did get there. They did get there at about 3:26, I think it was, Pacific Standard Time.
Breaking news.
Yeah, like quite recently. And it wasn't like, so I don't know if anyone watched the Perseverance landing or the Curiosity landing and they go touchdown confirmed and everyone jumps up and it was not that. It was actually very stressful because they got the time for it to have landed passed and there was no word from the spacecraft. There was no word from the lander. And so it was like it was very awkward to watch, I will say, because you have the announcers being like, "Oh, we're just standing by." And in the room with like the people actually like the flight controllers and the mission director, you could have probably heard a pin drop like in that room. It was just silence until it was like the MD came on and was like, okay, everyone go back and check all the numbers they have. And I was like, oh, this thing crashed, like that's not good. But then they found, it was very exciting. They said, we have a signal. It's just very weak. So the lander is talking to them. It's just a very weak signal. And that could mean any number of things. Either it landed and it's not oriented properly. So the antenna is not pointing directly the way they want it. And so we're just catching like an echo of it almost. Or it could mean something was damaged. Like we don't know. I actually have a page, like a web page up like in the corner that I've been refreshing, waiting to see if something has happened, and they still haven't said if anything is happening yet. But they did say we have touchdown. The spacecraft is talking. We just don't know anything right now of its health. But it is talking, which is half or 50, over 90% of the battle, honestly. It's just getting it on the moon in a good enough state to talk to you. So they did do it. I'm very happy for them.
Okay, excellent. Well, that this does give us hope that that there is some progress, because I think like some of the updates that have come through at the beginning of this year with Artemis, it was starting to like really set into the reality that this may be a much tougher mission than what was maybe proposed, right?
Yeah, and the thing is that it's hard. Like it's really hard to go to the moon. Like we think it's like, oh, it's so close.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still quite difficult to get there. So even with this mission, it landed fine. It was in, or sorry, it launched fine. It was in good health while it was there. It was actually supposed to land earlier today and it didn't. And the reason they delayed it, they did another lunar orbit, right? So part of it, you have to get to the moon. The second part, we have to launch, leave Earth, get into space, get on the right trajectory to the moon, and then enter lunar orbit. And then you just kind of orbit till you're ready to land. They
Hmm.
had to do another orbit, which is 2 hours. They had a 2 hour orbit around the moon because their landing technology wasn't working. So how this lander lands is through autonomous landing technology, which is pretty common now, where the spacecraft itself looks at the ground and it identifies hazards. It is able to tell how high up it is from the ground using lasers, how it hits the surface and reflects back. The lasers on Odysseus were not working. And so they would have no way of determining their distance or their horizontal velocity as they're coming down towards the moon. And so what they had to do is one of these NASA tech demos, the NDL, which is meant to help determine precise altitude and speed during landing. During that 2 hour orbit, they developed and uploaded a patch of code to the NDL. So the NDL, which was again supposed to be a tech demo, served the purpose of the landing technology. Right? It was like the only way they could land this thing was by using NDL, which is very cool. And I can't wait to hear more about the as that comes out in the next few days, like how exactly they fixed it and how they diagnosed the problem.
Yeah.
But that just goes to show, like, if this payload hadn't been on board, this landing might have looked vastly different, right? And
Right.
that was even before we get to landing and there being a communications issue. And everything in space is actively fighting against you being there. And so you have to have all of these plans and backup plans and people on the ground who get a call and go, this isn't working. We need to find a solution. You have 2 hours.
Right.
Like it's very, very stressful. It's a stressful job, but very awesome when it pays off. And so when there's delays with Artemis and when, especially in the context of us sending people, it's kind of like better to figure out that there's a problem on the ground than to
Mhm.
have a problem when you're in space, because it's
Yeah,
much harder to fix a problem in space than it is on Earth. Oh, the sun
obviously.
is here.
Hello, son. So great. So for the last little bit of this episode, if you're out there watching and want to get in on this conversation about the commercial landing that just hours ago, less than an hour ago, intuitive machines landing on the moon. Breaking news. You heard it. You heard it here first, folks. So we've got a few minutes. We do have another question, kind of leading up to Artemis. So I guess I'll tack on to that question. So between now and 2026, when the next Artemis is going to go, and then Artemis 3, we're looking at timelines sort of like beyond that. So how many people are we expecting to see on the surface with Artemis 3? Because Artemis 2 has 4 astronauts. Would all 4 astronauts on Artemis 3 be walking on the moon?
No, so two of them would go.
Two.
The idea is that two of them would stay on board Orion. Okay, it depends on what's built when and what's available. The idea is that two of them will stay in space, probably on board Orion, or yeah, on board Orion, or if the Lunar Gateway is ready, on Lunar Gateway, but that's looking less likely. So
Mhm.
probably staying on the Orion spacecraft, and then two will go down, and the other two will stay up in space.
Right. Okay. So then like going back to then Artemis 2, 2026, between now and 2026, what can we expect? What kind of action can we see in and around the moon? Are we going to see more of these commercial landings happening before we
Yeah.
get to that Artemis 2?
Yeah, so Artemis 2, hopefully 2025. Artemis 3 is 2026. But
Okay.
before, yeah, in the next year, we're supposed to like Viper is supposed to go. So Viper is the volatiles investigation polar something explorer, and it is going to be looking for ice, like going to the south pole of the moon, landing at the south pole of the moon, and looking for ice in those craters, right? So it is supposed to launch this year in November. I think is when that is supposed to go. That's kind of like one of the bigger missions because that will give us kind of the preliminary look of like what that water ice is going to look like and how deep it may be into the ground, right? How
Mhm.
far underground it is. There's also supposed to be a few other missions that are supposed to go, but they're all kind of on the like we kind of don't know about them till we get the go ahead that they're officially going. So there'll be for sure Viper. Parts of the Lunar Gateway are supposed to go up this year towards the end of the year as well.
Mhm.
The both of the NASA components. So the PPE, which is the power and propulsion element, and the Halo, the habitation and logistics outpost, is supposed to go up. Launched by SpaceX. So those are both kind of the two bigger things to look for. The CLPS, there was already an attempt of one, the Peregrine one that crashed, that didn't make it. That was also part of the one of the private companies trying to go. So there are attempts. It's just they're not always successful, and they often do get delayed for various reasons.
Okay, so lots to look forward to. And for our last few minutes, if you want to get in on this chat. So Marley, as we get forward, we're getting very close to equinox, so we're going to get more sun streaming into our offices for Ask an Astronomer. You're not actually going to be here
No.
in a couple of weeks, so I'm going to find a special guest to join us for our next episode, which is going to be on March the 7th. Of course, we've got Pi Day on March 14th. We're going to have a cultural celebration, though, around equinox. Actually, is it going to be actually on equinox? No, equinox is on the
No.
22nd, right? March 22nd? No,
Yeah, it's
March.
not on equinox, but it's
Right.
close.
But our celebration for Nowruz is going to be on March the 19th. So make sure to look out on our website for information on that very special event. We're going to have a very special planetarium show all around sort of Persian astronomy, a little bit of history, of course, a lot of culture. We're going to have music and some dancing and all of the fun stuff that's associated with Nowruz as we get into spring break. So lots of fun stuff. Looks like we do have our last final question. Actually, more just a comment. Just getting excited about Artemis 2 and Jeremy Hansen on board. Do you think we're going to get another Canadian astronaut on Artemis, or do you think that we're tapped out on those?
We still have another seat. So Canada got two seats in exchange for, well, it was because we signed on and it was like, oh, we'll give you two seats. But it's because we built Canada Arm 3. We got
Right.
two seats in exchange. Jeremy Hansen has taken one of them. The next, we will not have a seat on Artemis 3. That will all be American astronauts. I know they haven't confirmed it, but it will be all American astronauts.
Okay.
We will have a mission in like the later Artemis. So like looking at like 4, 5, 6 and
Great.
beyond is when we'll appear.
Okay. Well, fun stuff. Well, folks, do you have any final things for this episode, Marley?
Just this. So one of the commercial payloads is actually an art installation. So
Oh, wow.
this is the artist. They are, I think it's 100 and something. I can't remember the exact number. Steel balls painted with different moon phases, and they're meant to represent like achievements in like humanity's achievements all across the world and throughout time. So very cool. I linked his website if you wanted to check out the art installation. It's supposed to be on the moon, which is, I don't know, just kind of a neat thing. Like, so it's not just science that's going, like art has gone as well, which is pretty awesome.
Absolutely. I love it. We once had a talk a few years ago before your time, Marley, about a painter that was determined to be one of the astronauts to go to the moon. Of course, he was looking to go with one of the private missions in and around the moon, but I'm sure he's still at it because his dream was to paint the moon while orbiting around it.
That is very
Uh,
cool.
yeah. So love to see more artists going up there. You can check out this website here. If you can't see the full thing on Instagram, it's Jeff Kuhn, JeffKoon, moonphases.com. Marley, thank you so much for this episode. Thank you all, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube for watching. Of course, you can, if you missed part of the episode, you can always rewatch it on YouTube, as well as all of the past episodes of Ask an Astronomer that are on there. Please, like us, subscribe to our channel. Love to have you here for these episodes, and we will be back, not with Marley in 2 weeks, but I will be here in 2 weeks on March the 7th, 4 p.m. Pacific time. Take care.